This next session, before we get into the performance characteristics of barrier and crash cushions, we're going to talk about a very important question, and that is, how do you decide that barrier is, in fact, something you ought to do at a particular location? We're essentially going to talk about barrier warrants, and a lead into that is the discussion on clear recovery zones. So without further ado, unless there are some questions left over. Okay, we talked about low-cost improvements. Remember, the best thing to do is keep the darn motorist on the road in the first place. But obviously, we're not going to do that all the time. In fact, let me ask an embarrassing question. How many of you have ever run off the road? My goodness. Usually I get a couple of hands. Well, apparently it wasn't a fatal crash because you all look pretty much alive. Of course, it is early in the day. If I ask this again later this afternoon, I may not get the same response. But yeah, a lot of people run off the road. Anybody run off the road and hit guardrail? Can you tell us what happened?
It was an icy road coming down the road.
Icy road?
Icy road, went in straight into it, just bounced off. I wasn't going for 15, 20 miles an hour.
Okay, an icy road, you hit it at a low speed and it kept you from whatever was behind it. Okay, a success story, very good. Okay, sometimes it's kind of discouraging because we spend an awful lot of time talking about barrier. We put miles and miles of it out there, and people just don't hit it very often. So sometimes you wonder, why do you bother? That was facetious in case anybody missed it. But a lot of it's been out there for 20, 30 years and nobody's ever hit it. You know, you've got some old Tut Hill guardrail here in California that looks old, but pieces of it haven't been hit yet. Okay, we're going to talk about what the clear zone is, how to apply it, and then we're going to talk about warrants. What types of barriers typically require shielding? By definition, the clear zone is essentially a clear area from the edge of the traveled way extending out some distance. Now, if somebody asks you, well, what's the clear zone? 30. For counties, it's probably pretty low, but if we're talking about state engineers and they were talking about freeways, 30 foot is a number that usually comes into play. But we're going to talk about that and tell you where it came from. Now, if you can get a clear zone like this, you're really, really doing well. The utility poles are a hazard, but they're kind of a spot hazard. You've got a good chance of missing them if you run off the road. Incidentally, California is one of the very few states that essentially requires delineation on their utility poles. I think that ought to be a national standard. That's a very good thing to do, particularly when the poles are about the only thing out there or they're very close to the edge of the roadway. Okay, AASHTO started talking about clear zone way back in '74. How many of you were not even born in '74? That's a fairly old class. usually at least half of you guys raise your hands. Okay, anyway, it said it's desirable to have a recovery area, an unencumbered roadside area, as wide as practical. And as wide as practical makes sense. But then the 1977 AASHTO barrier guide came out, and then it said, well, the clear zone isn't a fixed number. It varies depending upon some characteristics. And that includes design speed, which makes sense. The faster you're going, the longer it's going to take you to stop. Nobody's going to argue about that. Slope type and steepness. If you run off the road on a fairly steep slope, you're going to probably go to the bottom of the slope. So you're going to go further away from the road with less vehicle control than you would have if the roadside were flat. If you're running off the road on a cut slope, then gravity is working towards you and you're not going to go quite as far from the edge of the roadway. Yes, sir?
Are we still focusing on design speed, or are we shifting to target speed?
Target speed?
Yep. Like the design speed. Well, how fast we want the traffic to go, and keep that in mind when we're designing our roadways. Rather than, the design speed is 70 miles per hour, and for a 50-mile road where people can go 70 miles an hour, but that's way above the speed limit.
I'm not quite sure how to answer that. Basically, for purposes of selecting a clear zone or other things, we generally use design speed because we typically know what that is. Obviously, it's in some cases the actual operating speeds are significantly less, at least on portions of the roadway, and in some cases they're probably more, particularly on some of the freeways. Traffic volume. How does traffic volume affect how far you're going to go if you run off the road? Okay, the quick and dirty answer is it doesn't make any difference. If you run off the road at 70 miles an hour and a 10-degree angle, you're going to go the same distance as if it's a county road versus I-5, or as you folks would say, V5. So the only difference between those two is if you do it off the 5, there's probably going to be people watching you do it. If you're on a county road, you may be all by yourself. Ken?
Dick, the only difference I'd say there is if you have a roadway and you have 10 vehicles on it a day versus 10,000 vehicles on it a day, probably a better chance that something's going to happen with 10,000 vehicles versus 10.
Sure.
So I think it does play in that sense.
Yeah,
of
there's
probability of it happening.
absolutely no question that the volume plays into the probability of somebody running off the road. But the basic fact is once somebody runs off the road, it doesn't matter how much traffic is on that particular road. But sure, it's modified because it's an economic factor. You can't provide the same clear zone on a county road or a city street as you do on the freeway. Pardon? It's as I said, it's an economic factor. It's kind of a cutoff point. Maybe this will explain it a little bit better. Okay, where did that 30-foot originally come from? Well, it came from a study that was done at the General Motors Proving Ground, where they were losing a little bit of time and some injuries from their test drivers running off the track. So they did a study, and they only looked at just slightly over 200 instances where their test drivers ran off the track. And after they looked at each one, they found out that about 40% were able to stop before they went 10 feet laterally from the edge of the road. They looked a little bit further and they found, well, 80% didn't go any further than 30 feet. And then continuing it, they said, well, 90% stopped within 50 feet. So what we figured, or the engineers figured, well, this is a pretty good break point. If we can provide a 30-foot minimum clear zone, then 80% of the vehicles that run off the road are likely to stop in that distance. But again, the data came from a very small number of cases. They were professional drivers or test drivers riding on a one-way familiar track. And it's not too surprising that they were able to do that. But that doesn't correlate to the driving population in general. Except for us folks in the highway profession, you don't see a lot of professional drivers on the road. You see people doing some pretty dumb things, actually. And we're not always driving on one-way roads, and we're often driving on roads that are unfamiliar to us. So that 30 foot is a minimum number. It's better than we used to do because we used to not think about it at all. When the interstate was first built in the late 50s, early 60s, we had bridge piers right at the edge of the shoulder and didn't even think about shielding them. Well, we've come a long ways from that since then, so we're doing it. Yes, sir?
Just out of curiosity, on vertical axis, that percent, what does that represent? I can't quite figure out how that relates to this graph. The percentage on vertical axis of this graph, what does that represent? Would you say it's 20%?
Okay, this is
20% of the cases?
This is a cumulative percentage of cases. In other words, 20%. Yeah, I'll say 20%, and then this is a distance down here. So 20% were able to stop, we're not able to stop, so 80% were. Okay? All right, then in the Astro Roadside Design Guide, we kind of put this together, and we made the decision that, well, we don't want people to think that this clear zone is a fixed number. So as you can see, there's based on the design speed, the traffic volume, and whether it's a fill slope and how steep or a cut slope, these numbers are not fixed numbers. 14 to 16 feet, 32 to 40 feet, 14 to 18 feet. We've got that clear zone pinned down to a couple of feet in each case. How many of you have military service? got a couple. How many are hunters? I thought maybe in the rural part of the state there'd be a few more hunters, but anyway. What do hunters and soldiers have in common? I asked this question, and I'm pretty sure it was in California about 20, 25 years ago, and someone in the back of the room said, "They shoot people." I decided I would never go hunting in California. But the answer I'm looking for, of course, is rifles. They have guns. And if you've been in the military, you may have spent half a day on the rifle range where you fire 3 rounds at a target and you try to get all those bullet holes really close together. When I was a kid growing up in New Hampshire before the deer season, my dad and I used to go to a nearby sand pit, essentially for the same purpose. We'd fire a few rounds at some targets, and if we hit them, then the sights were set properly. But if you can get a grouping of bullets that's very, very tight, but the bullseye is down here somewhere, it's not very accurate shooting. It's very, very precise. The bullets are going where you want them to, but it's not accurate because you missed the bullseye. And I like to use this analogy when I look at this chart. It's very, very precise. It's like, man, we've got that clear zone pinned down to within 2 or 3 or 4 feet. But as far as accuracy, yeah, plus or minus 50%. Usually there's either a dead silence or a bunch of sighs in the audience when I make that statement. Because most of you are engineers, and you may have gravitated towards the engineering profession simply because you like numbers. You like to plug numbers into a formula and get the answer to 5 or 6 decimal places, right? And for most of engineering, of course, you need to do that. You don't want your bridges falling down. You don't want your pavements rutting right after you open the road to traffic. You don't want your culverts washing out in a 2-year flood. So for most of engineering, you have to be both precise and accurate. But clear zone numbers are different because there's no rule, there's no regulation, there's no physical limitation that says when you run off the road, you can only go 18 feet or 20 feet or 30 feet. Now, common sense will tell you that when you run off the road, you go until you hit something and stop, roll over, or are able to control your car and stop safely or return to the roadside. But 30 feet is just not very much distance when you're going 60 or 70 miles an hour. So where does that lead you with clear zone? Keep in mind that these are minimum distances. And I like to paraphrase John Fitzgerald Kennedy. When you're asking, you don't ask the question, how much clear zone do I need, and pick this chart for minimum. You ask instead, how much clear zone can I reasonably get? And if you get as much as you reasonably, practically can, then you've probably done the best job that you can. You should always meet the minimum or document why you didn't, but if you can get more than that, go for it. One example is if you've got a culvert that's 10 feet from the edge of the road, and you go through all the trouble of extending the culvert and putting a new end wall on, and when you're done, it ends up 20 feet from the road. You've done a little bit of good, but if you're going to extend something, you should extend it far enough so it's almost unlikely to be hit. All right. Crash rates on curves, and again, all other things being equal, the crash rate on a curve could be 3 times as high as it would be on a tangent section of roadway. If somebody's going too fast for conditions or just plain too fast and not paying attention, they're probably not going to run off the road on a straight section unless they fall asleep, but more likely on a curve. So what the roadside design guide suggests is that you extend the clear zone on the outside of the curve, and how much? Well, it depends upon the design speed, the sharpness of the curve, and then you multiply the standard tangent clear zone by a factor. And you can see here the biggest factor is 50%, 1.5. So if you've got a sharp curve, your normal clear zone is 20 feet, and you say, okay, we'll make it 30 feet on the outside of the curve. Some states do this, some states don't. But if that additional 10 feet or so isn't flat and traversable and recoverable, then you're probably wasting your time messing with it, because it's not likely to do much good. We talked a little bit about reversible and recoverable. If it's flatter than 4 to 1 and it's a solid slope with no obstructions on it, Recoverable and traversable means you can drive on it, you can stop on it, you can turn and get back on the road. If it's between 3 to 1 and 4 to 1, it can still be traversable. Again, if it's smooth and firm and not rutted and it doesn't have anything on the slope, but it's non-recoverable because you're likely to go to the bottom of the slope. And then finally, if it's steeper than 3 to 1, you're probably going to go to the bottom of the slope with your wheels pointing skyward. So for non-recoverable slopes, it recommends that you provide a clear run out at the toe of the slope, and additional clear zone may be needed. A lot of words here. Let's see what that basically means. We've got a cross section where the suggested minimum clear zone distance is this shaded area, and a portion of that is on a non-recoverable slope. So this cannot logically be a portion of the clear zone. So what you essentially do is take this non-recoverable portion and add it at the base of the slope. Again, in a lot of ways, this is kind of playing with numbers. Whether that's going to do any good to a motorist is a little bit hard to tell. But I will say this, it worked for me once. Now, at one point in my career with Federal Highways, I worked in New Mexico, and I was going down to a plan-in-hand inspection. I hit some black ice on a curvy section of road, and being a professional driver, I countersteered in the correct direction, and I kept fishtailing, and before I knew it, I was going practically straight down a slope that I swear was 2 to 1. And I looked ahead through the windshield, and I saw this pinon tree at the base of the slope, and I knew I was going to dent that government car. Just as I got to the base of the slope, the car spun sideways and stopped. Absolutely no sheet metal damage whatsoever. So I had 2 blown out tires, but I'm not sure if that occurred bouncing down the hill or when the wrecker pulled me back up on the roadway a couple hours later. But at least in one instance, a recovery area at the base of the slope, did what theoretically it's supposed to do. But I wouldn't count on that happening again. All right, clear zone and curbs. And again, there's some cities represented here and probably some urban type portions of the county where you've got curbs. It's important to keep in mind that a curb does not modify what the minimum clear zone should be, because a curb has no redirectional capabilities. If you hit a curb with a car, you're going to bounce up and you're going to keep on going. So theoretically, the clear zone with a curb should be essentially the same as if the curb were not there. But again, from a practical standpoint, in most urban areas or built-up areas, you're never going to get that. So what you do need to get, though, is a operational distance. This 1.5 foot is considered a operational offset. So if somebody's parking against a curb, they can open their doors. If some truck has large mirrors, it doesn't clip on the utility poles or the sign supports or whatever you might have. So it's important to remember that 1.5 foot is not a clear zone. It's an operational offset. And this afternoon, we're going to talk more about guardrail and curbs and talk about what some of the things that can be done. For potential hazards, obviously you can tell with bridge piers, large ditches, non-breakaway sign and light supports, bodies of water, steep embankments, and of course opposing traffic on divided freeways. Those are all things that you don't want to hit. All other things being equal, hitting a properly installed, designed, and maintained guardrail would be preferable to hitting any one of these things. But in addition to what the objects are, it's also important to keep in mind where are they in relation to the roadway? Are they likely to be hit? And we'll talk a little bit about that. If you look at the barrier warrants in the AASHTO Roadside Design Guide, it's got, again, the list of things that might be shielded occasionally. But if you look at the guidelines, it's generally required a judgment decision, not generally required, judgment, generally required, judgment. A lot of things are not black or white. You're going to have to make an intelligent decision in the field as to whether or not some of these things warrant shielding by themselves and warrant shielding because they're in a vulnerable location. And that's where a clear zone comes in. Again, typically if something is outside the minimum clear zone, you don't shield it. But in some cases, that may not be the best approach. Embankment warrants, this is from CalTrans. Basically, they say if the slope is flatter than 3 to 1, generally the guardrail is worse than running down the slope. But it's important to keep in mind that the barrier is not warranted for the embankment itself, but there may be obstacles on the slope, or there may be trees, a river, or railroad tracks at the bottom of the slope that would require some shielding. Again, you normally do not put in barrier if hitting the barrier would be more severe than running off the road at the same location. Now, that's easy to say, but trying to make a decision in the field is what is better or what is worse. That's another story altogether. It's a tough decision sometimes. Cross sections, again from AASHTO, if the foreslope and the back slope combination end up in this gray area, it's considered a traversable ditch. If they end up outside this area, that means the ditch is so steep that a vehicle is either going to nosedive into the back slope and stop, or possibly overturn or do something else. Now, on a lot of county roads, your problem is the right-of-way line is probably right about here, right off the edge of the pavement. I think there are a lot of county roads where the width of pavement is almost equal to the right-of-way that you have. So it's pretty hard to modify a ditch when you have a situation like that. But if you can't get in the preferred area, the best compromise is to make the foreslope as flat as you possibly can. And then even if the back slope is relatively steep, if it's a smooth back slope without a rock outcropping or something, probably the worst that would happen is the vehicle would slide to the bottom of the ditch and scrape the passenger side of the vehicle along that vertical portion. Again, if it's a smooth slope, if it's an earth slope, probably not a big deal.
I work for the county, and there are some projects we have where the trees grow right against the road, and when you do a modification to a project and you're trying to get your recoverable slope and then your clear zone on the bottom, it would require more right-of-way to be purchased, and then there's additional trees that would be taken out, so there's kind of our weighing our pros and cons on whether to provide that.
Okay, you basically have several projects where you have trees essentially right at the edge of the roadway, and the question is it worth the hassle of removing the trees and providing a slope and some type of recovery area? Or the option would be simply repave the roadway and leave the trees right next to the edge of the road? Well, my answer to a lot of questions is going to be it depends. Now, I know there's a lot of rural roads in California that has trees right next to the road. I think one of the most obvious examples is Redwood National Park. I mean, you drive through that and you've got these monster trees just inches from the edge of the road. And nobody in his right mind is going to suggest you cut those down. You know, if they're just small trees or volunteer trees and you get them while they're young enough, you may be able to do it. But in any case, it's likely to be a compromise. If you can't do anything else, as you saw on Will's chart, the last thing to do is delineation. You know, if you can put some delineation by the trees, particularly the ones that are closer to the road than anything else, you know, that may in fact be the best you can do. Again, no simple answers to some of those questions. Okay, I've got a couple of pictures that I took here earlier this year in California, and the question I'm going to ask each of you is the barrier warranted, or is barrier warranted? I thought you fixed this. Oh, there we go. Okay, should there be barrier here? Yes. What's the hazard? Okay, the bridge rail is obviously a hazard, but if you miss the bridge railing and squeeze in between the end of the railing and the rock outcropping, dang it. There's supposed to be a slide in here that's not coming out.
What would you do if there's a road that goes off to the right? How would you put a barrier for that?
If there's a road that comes out very close to the bridge, that is a problem that we're gonna talk about that situation after lunch, where you've got an intersecting road or a driveway that prevents you from putting in an adequate run of barrier. If it's very, very close, the best you might be able to do is use a crash cushion of some sort rather than a run of guardrail. I don't know why this other slide isn't coming out. Okay, how about this one? Now, we're driving by there pretty fast. I wasn't exactly sure what that was. I don't know if it's an ancient culvert head wall, an old building ruins, or whatnot. But as you can see, it's right in the middle of the curve. And regardless of what it is, it's probably nothing that you want to run into. So the question again, should it be shielded? The best choice is what? Get rid of it. Get it out of there if you can possibly do that. If you can't do that, and if you don't have the money to put in barrier, at least this might be a curve where chevron alignment signs could be very effective if you don't actually go ahead and put in the guardrail. How about this?
The mailman needs that for access.
It seems like that would make it harder for the mailman to deliver. He has to drive in there and then back out. But I think you've hit on what I'm looking at here. The barrier should be better than the hazard. What's the hazard here? You know, those mailboxes aren't particularly hazardous, and even if they are, they're well off the road, and it's a stop condition anyway, so the speeds are going to be relatively low. However, I would bet that if somebody hit this old BCT terminal, the maintenance folks would go back and either replace it with a current crash-worthy terminal or replace it exactly the way it is now. What they should do is consider pulling all that guardrail out, because the guardrail is obviously the worst hazard there, as opposed to just running off the road at that point. In fact, when I made the presentation in Los Angeles, someone came up to me afterwards and said, "Hey, we're doing a project here. What should we do with the guardrail?" And of course, not being there on the site, I suggested if it's really needed up here, then you can terminate it here with a crash-worthy terminal. If it's not needed here, and from the picture that looks reasonably recoverable, then just take it all out. Don't put it back in. But the first thing maintenance people typically do when something is hit is they go back and fix it like it was or upgrade it. And the first thing you should do is ask yourself, do we really need barrier here? Is it doing us any good? And most of the time the answer will be yes, but occasionally it will be no. Remember, barrier is a hazard. You saw again in Will's presentation that in California there were something like 90 crashes where the first thing people hit was guardrail, and in 2/3 of those cases the guardrail actually killed them. I think it was 90 first harmful event and 60 most harmful event. So guardrail can be dangerous, and you need to keep that in mind and minimize the use of it to the extent that you really can. Okay, this is a little bit further down the road from the mailboxes, but yeah, that's a pretty big hole. And again, if you can extend the culvert and get it out beyond the right-of-way fence and get rid of this vertical concrete head wall, that's certainly the #1 choice. Single delineator, does a little bit of good, but if all you're going to do is delineate it, a series of hazard panels leading up to the hazard would be a lot more effective. It would provide much better positive guidance to a motorist coming up to this intersection. How about this? Now, apparently somebody had a somewhat interesting ride. I don't know what caused that. This is the end of a very long downgrade, and if you're distracted by the view and miss the turn, you're in trouble. Is it a good place for guardrail? Well, if the parking area weren't there, it would be pretty obvious that you ought to have barrier. With the additional recovery area, again, it's kind of a decision that you have to make on the spot. But if nothing else, it certainly ought to have good curve warning signs in advance, and this would probably be a good place for one of those big one-direction arrows, so people don't keep on going straight and end up in the reservoir. Yeah, a barrier at the back of the parking lot would be better than nothing. But remember, well, you can't remember because we haven't told you yet, but barrier is basically tested at one angle, and it's essentially a 25-degree angle. If you hit barrier at 90 degrees, all bets are off. Again, it depends what kind of vehicle you're in and how fast you're going when you hit it. But yes, barrier on the backside.
Railing or something like that.
Pardon?
A cable railing and timber or something.
Cable might work, but even hitting cable at 90 degrees, you've got a good chance of possibly going through it. From the opposite direction, the guardrail may very well be warranted, and if so, carrying it around the outside of the parking area is a good idea. Okay, we talked about the clear zone concept. I hope I didn't confuse you too much. Get as much as you can, but at least get the minimums that are recommended by AASHTO and CalTrans. And then we talked about objects that require shielding. The basic question you need to ask is the guardrail worse than what would happen if a motorist ran off the road without the guardrail? And again, that's not always a black or white, doesn't always have a black or white answer. Lots of gray.